Samuel Cyril Rivers was born January the 20th, 1928, in the community of Minden. That's 87 years ago. His parents were Thomas and Lucy Rivers of Minden. Lucy's maiden name was Kernahan. Sam grew up and spent his early life in the Minden area. He married Dorothy Peck at the West Guildford Gospel Chapel on July the 2nd, 1954. Now, Dorothy predeceased Sam by a couple of years. Many of you were at that funeral. If Dorothy had lasted another year or so, last year, 2014, would have been their 60th anniversary. Now that is something of an accomplishment. It's something that is increasingly less common in our modern society, but it's something that's exemplary, and we should look to it as an example. In this regard, that is their marriage, they set a great example for their family. They set a great example for the Christian community. And they set a great example for the community at large. I believe that God's Word teaches that marriage is one man, one woman for life. And that's what Sam believed. He didn't just believe it and say it. He practiced it. Born to their union were 3 children. Susan, who is now Susan Ellison, Virginia, and Tom Rivers. In the mid-60s, they moved to Wilberforce from West Guildford and established a business called Sam's Texaco. Many of us, I'm sure, remember that. Sam was predeceased by his brothers, Milton, John, and Gordon, and is survived by brother Joe and sister Betty Davis. Sam's grandchildren are Tammy, Sandy, David, Andy, James, Elliot, Bobby, and Melissa. Sam's great-grandchildren are Violet, Dakota, Jody, Gloria, Philip, Belle, Alyssa, Jonathan, David, Michael, and Stephen. Sam went to be with his Lord on July the 5th, 2015 at 10 p.m. He passed away at Extendicare in Halliburton. Sam became a Christian as a young man. He was born again, entering the family of God when he was 27 years old. Sam and Dorothy came to the Harcourt, Wilberforce area, not to seek their fortune in a business called Sam's Texaco, but rather they came as missionaries to help a fledgling Christian work, which resulted in this chapel being built 50 years ago. Sam was the kind of mechanic that could fix any vehicle of his day with some wire and a pair of pliers. A good illustration of that was my old Ford tractor that dated back into the 40s. It was acting up, and Sam took a look at it. He said it needs a set of points. Well, we tried to get points for it, and I think they'd quit making them sometime before. They weren't available at any rate. Sam said, I think I can fix that with a piece of hacksaw blade. And he put a piece of hacksaw blade to make the points flex the way they were supposed to in there. It ran for 2 more years that I had it, and I sold it with a piece of Sam's hacksaw blade, flexing the points. He kept a number of my vehicles going, even though several of them were well over the hill. I can remember one evening coming back from Bancroft. We'd taken loads of teenagers down to a youth rally in Bancroft many years ago. And as we were leaving, I happened to be following him. It wasn't by design, it's just the way we pulled out of the parking lot. I was following him. All of a sudden, I lost power in my '59 Pontiac station wagon. And there was an awful noise in the back end. I managed to pull over onto the shoulder, and I saw Sam's tail lights drifting into the distance. No, everybody didn't have a cell phone then. I couldn't call them and say, hey, come back. I'm desperate. I knew I'd have to wait till he got home, which would probably be an hour and a half. In the meantime, no PP came along and asked me what I was doing and if he could help. I said, I'm concerned about these young people. I know their parents will be worried about them. He said, can I take them home in the cruiser? I hadn't expected that, but I said, well, I'd like to see them get home, but some live as far out as Essenville. We were about 2 miles south of Bancroft at this point on 28. I asked the kids if they wanted to go home in the cruiser, and they were all keen for it. So he took them home. That relieved part of my dilemma. And then I phoned Sam, and Sam came with his trusty old tow truck, which was a military truck, an army truck, kind of a snub nose and a big boom out the back, and a winch that you turned this way, not with the button, but hand crank. And that he came and winched me up and dragged me home. And the axle had come out and broken, actually, untwisted, and the wheel had come out against the fender skirt. That's what made the awful noise. Sam got her fixed up in a short period of time. Sam bought an old school bus and used it as a church bus for a number of years. Elmer Smith, who I see visiting with us today, was visiting me just a few days ago, a week or so ago, and he was referring to the fact that he rode that bus along with 25 other people. He also drove a school bus for the school board for 14 years. Sam served both as an elder and as a deacon here at the chapel for many years. He was involved in the actual building of this chapel, and if you were to look closely, you could find his fingerprints all over the place, including the very peak outside up there. Remember when the Easton fellows and Bob Hoover were laying the bricks? Kelvin Huey and Sam and I were trying to keep the bricks there to keep them going. And Sam was right up there in that very peak. And from that peak, which is extremely high because the ground falls away, it's much higher than the peak out here. From that peak to the basement corner, Sam's fingerprints can be found. He took the maintenance of the building very seriously. I remember a work party that we had here, 10 years ago. The Greens were at it, the Van Hoffens were at it. Greens are both deceased now, the Van Hoffens have moved away. Maybe some of you were at it, I can't just remember who all was at it. But all of a sudden, there was a blinding flash of light went through the basement down there. And the lights went out. And I looked over towards Sam, and there at his feet was an electrical cord writhing like a snake with fire shooting out of it. Somebody grabbed it quick and jerked it out of the wall. And there was Sam standing with a skill saw with about 15 inches hanging from the skill saw. He'd cut the cord off. Well, we didn't let him live that one down for a long time. For a long time. I'd like to read a portion of God's Word that is often read at funerals and very well known. The 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. He was Sam's shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's where Sam is now, in the house of the Lord forever. I'd like to share with you a few of my remembrances of Sam. When you consider a 60-year friendship, not just like I had friends in high school, and I'd still consider them friends, but some of them I haven't seen for 20 years. It's not a very intimate friendship, really, when it's broken up like that. But somebody that you would have exchange with several times a week. And I did that for most of these 60 years with Sam. How do you reduce that, even just using the highlights, to an hour's service? Well, it's pretty impossible, but I'm going to make an attempt. I gave Sam reason by times to strain that friendship. I remember before I was married, I was over at camp, and Mediba Bible camp, that was, back in those days. And I had one of these vehicles that I've referred to already that wasn't too dependable, and it was giving trouble. And I had to go somewhere, and Sam said, well, take mine. Take my vehicle. So I thanked him, and I think it was a 51 Chev, blue Chev that he had. And I headed down the hill at camp and down the road. I thought, man, this thing is just dragging. It's godless. And I couldn't get over it. And I pressed a little harder on the accelerator to try to get a little more zip out of it. Not much difference. And then I looked in the rearview mirror and realized I was leaving a thin trail of blue smoke. And I thought maybe I should get out and check things out, which I did. fellow came along that knew a lot more about cars than I did at that time. And he was looking around. You could feel the heat radiating from the vehicle. It was a case of wear. He stuck his fingers in around the brake drum and brought them back. And if you hadn't been quick, they'd have been blistered. He said, "I think I know your problem." He opened the door, reached in, and released the handbrake. He said, "I think you'll be okay now." Well, that was embarrassing and awkward, but then second round of embarrassment was to relate that to Sam. But Sam, and he had reason to say this to me on numerous occasions. What was Sam's reaction? "Well, it proves you're only human." I heard him say that to me a number of times. That was just one of them. I remember working with him on Madiba Bible Camp ceiling in the dining room at the back of the house. We were putting up strapping. Now, you don't have to be too fussy to put up strapping because it's all going to be covered up anyway. And he and I were working alone there at it, and we would run inspections on each other's hammering, make sure the nail was completely driven home, and count the number of bruises around the nail where the nail had been missed, kind of thing. We were giving each other a bit of a hard time. On such occasions where we were together, Sam liked to offer me marriage advice. Now, I was about 25, and at 25, I could have counted on the fingers of one hand the number of times that I had taken a young lady out on what might be called a date. Some people will consider that slow, but at any rate, I had a lot of people concerned about my marital status, and a lot of them were quite liberal with advice. Some even tried to provide incentives. At any rate, I do remember 2 pieces of advice that Sam gave me, marriage advice, back in those days. He used to say this, and I heard him say this repeatedly. He said, "It only takes 2 to make a marriage." I think Sue knows what's coming. Hey? Young woman and her mother. So that was one piece of marital advice. The other was, love is blind. You know the rest of that one too? Marriage is an eye-opener. Love is blind, but marriage is an eye-opener. I remember one time we had an evangelist here. His name was Bruce Scott. An excellent man. He was a beautiful soloist as well. He brought canned music with him. He was a one-man presentation. And that suited us just fine. Didn't have a lot of people. This was back in the very early days. Didn't have a lot of people with a lot of talents. But the day came. He was going to be with us for a week's services. We call it a crusade. Just copied off Billy Graham. But we were having our crusade. And the chapel was comfortably full. And Bruce was here. I was all excited and revved. And Sam was sitting down in about there somewhere. And I looked at my order of service and I said, now I'm going to ask Sam Rivers to lead us in prayer, which he proceeded to do. Now, this is a confession on my part. I was not listening to Sam. I was not paying attention to what he was saying or what was going on. I was thinking about 3 items ahead on the program and trying to get everything sort of set in my mind as to what was coming. Finally, Sam said amen and sat down, and everything was quiet. I said, and now I'm going to call on Sam Rivers to lead us in prayer. He said, I just did. And then he said, it proves you're only human. He waited till after the service for that, mercifully. You were visiting Sam around 10 o'clock at night, and he was starting to get sleepy-eyed. And I heard this line often, but I know he used it on others. Say, well, Dorothy, if we went to bed, these folks could go home. Yeah, if we went to bed, these folks could go home. And just about the time he got to that point with me one night, the phone rang. He answered it. It's in the middle of the winter, a very cold night in January, and a woman had slipped off the road. So he said he'd come. So we headed out with this tow truck, big boom out the back and, crank winch. We headed down to Torrey Hill and down the Gibson Road, which is the road that runs behind the lake. Highway runs in front of the lake. Gibson Road runs behind the lake. We went up in there about a quarter of a mile, and sure enough, we found a vehicle off the road. We also found that there were 2 reasons why she'd ended up there. One, the conditions were not the best, and secondly, she was severely inebriated. However, we proceeded. I jumped up in there and turned the crank. I was good at that. I was raised on a farm with a cream separator and a corn cutter and a turnip pulper. I've done that a lot of times. And I got up there and started cranking, and Sam had attached to the vehicle, and up it came. And we got her drawn out on the road. Well, it was time for her to pay. And guess what? She didn't have any money. Well, Sam helped people on a good many occasions where that was the case. However, in her state, she decided she would try to compensate for not having money, and she undertook to give Sam a kiss. Well, there's poor old Sam trying to fend this woman off, her coming at him like this, me sitting up in the truck with a ringside seat. Just hilarious. I was afraid to come down in case she decided to go for me, but I was safe where I was. I was safe where I was. Well, finally he got into the truck and away we went. There were some hilarious times like that. There were some not so hilarious times that I remember with Sam. I remember about the same time one evening, it was in the summertime though, a lady who attended here, she's with the Lord long since now, she called about 10 o'clock at night. Now, she and her husband rented a couple of cabins, I knew that. And she said, one of our renters is in an awful state, and he's talking about committing suicide. Can you come and talk to him? It's about bedtime. Well, I can think of other things I'd rather do about bedtime, but I said to Sam, "Are you up to going?" And he said, "Yes." So away we went. Talked to the man for an hour or so, and got him somewhat calmed down, and he didn't follow through on his threat, mercifully. Couldn't talk about Sam without mentioning his involvement in the Gideons. Gideons, a Bible Placement Society that most of us are somewhat familiar with. And at one time, Sam was the leader of the Gideons locally. And I remember they had a big banquet at the Legion, Gideon banquet. There was 100 people or so there. And as a guest of honor, they had the director of education. He tried to curry favor with the director of education. He gave them permission to come in and distribute their Bibles to the grade 5s. That all fit together and made sense. At any rate, the director of education, a few days later, week later maybe, was visiting my school. He did that routinely as part of his job. And he said, "I enjoyed the Gideon banquet." Now, I wasn't part of it in any way. I wasn't part of the Gideons, and I wasn't part of doing anything at the banquet. But he knew I was there. He said, I enjoyed that Gideon banquet. And I said, "Yeah, it's a good organization." He said, "I was impressed with the man that was the chairman for the evening." And that was Sam. I said, "Yes, I can understand that." He said, "I worked with that man when I was in university. I worked at a sawmill up north of West Guildford. And that man worked there, and I worked for a couple of summers up there at that sawmill. I got to know that fellow," referring to Sam, "pretty well." I said, "Well," he said, "he doesn't have much education." I said, "I was aware of that." He said, "I was impressed with the way he read and handled the order of the events. And he said his very little education, less than a full grade school education. And he was quite wowed and impressed with Sam. But I said, where he got much of his education was from his reading and study of the Bible. And I believe that. It's sad to think that when Edgerton Ryerson and Bishop Strawn were setting up education in Ontario in the 1800s, in some schools there was only one book. It was the Bible, not placed by the Gideons then. This predates the Gideons, but by Bible societies in Britain. There's no money for anything else, and math and spelling and language, everything was taught from the one book, the Bible. Well, that could be done if you're a good teacher. So I said to the director of education, I said, "Sam is self-taught in a lot of ways, and most of it came from the Bible." And it made me think of the book of Acts, where Peter and John are being criticized for being untrained and uneducated men. People were wowed at what they could do, these untrained, uneducated men. They were fishermen. But later on in the chapter, it says they took note of them, that they had been with Jesus. That was the source of what abilities Sam had. He spent much time in Scripture. And finally, one thing further. Back in the early 70s, it became an issue in some churches about the use of communion cups. A lot of churches used a single goblet. The trend and the drift was going toward a tray of individual cups. And some people didn't care, and some people felt strongly about one way, and some people felt strongly about the other way. Sam felt strongly. He thought the fact that the Bible used the singular word cup meant we shouldn't change. That's what we had been doing. However, in the course of much discussion and exchange, it was decided that we would go to a tray of cups, individual cups. And I know Sam was disappointed at that because he wasn't at all convinced it was what we should be doing. But the next Sunday morning we had communion. And in our communion service, call it the Lord's table, it's open to any of the men to distribute the elements, the bread and the wine. And somebody gave thanks for the bread, and it was distributed as usual. There were a few quiet, meditative moments. And then, and this is the first time we were using the tray of cups, Sam stood to his feet, gave thanks for the wine, and distributed it. I see something of greatness in that. Being able to not resist, and he could have easily resisted. He could have said, they're not going to do it my way. My way's the Bible way. They're not going to do it my way. I just won't have anything more to do. No, that wasn't Sam. The very next Sunday, he was prepared to go along with what had been decided. A lot of Christians can't handle that. I remember going to Peterborough and going to Dave Fisher's store, Ambassador Bookstore, buying this tray and bringing it home. We had it on the communion table. Sam was the first one to use it, although he had not really been in favor of it. Well, there's much that can be said about Sam. And I've taken a lot of time. I could take that much more, but I'm not going to. Rather, I'm going to give you an opportunity. If you have a remembrance of Sam, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share it. And to start this off, I've asked somebody who was very prominent in Sam's life back in his 20s. Not in the 20s, but in his 20s. When a lot of significant things were happening in his life. And I was just barely getting to know Sam at that time. Somebody that knew him well and had a lot to do with him at that point. We're just so pleased to have Stu and Jackie visiting with us from Arizona. They lived in West Guilford at that time. And I'm going to ask Stu to just where he is there to stand and say a few words about Sam back in those days.
Can I come up there?
Yes, okay.
You'll let me come up there. My voice may need a little help, okay?
Okay, I have the same problem.
He understands. Thank you. Sam and Dot came into our lives in our early years of ministry at West Guilford. And it was in the months of December in 1951 and 1952 that we invited Harold Harper to come and have special meetings in West Guilford. And that was at the public school. And we were able to just be there. And it was at that time that Sam and Dot opened their hearts and lives to Jesus Christ. And then in the summer of 1953, it was my privilege to baptize them at Grass Lake in West Guilford. And then it was in the summer of 52 that we, my wife and I, leased the property became known as Mediba. And it was at that time that we started to build a new chapel at West Guilford. And so it was in the summer of 1954, on July the 2nd. I think that was the date you shared, wasn't
Yes.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Charles. We had the first wedding at the chapel in West Guilford with Sam and Dot. In 1955, for the greater good of ministry and outreach, my wife and I donated our assets in Mediba to incorporate Mediba Bible Camp. And we chose 10 men to be part of that first group of the board, and Sam was one. And over the years, this humble, faithful man of God, generous in his time and resources, resolute in his convictions, stood with us in those early years of camp and the chapel at West Guilford. And along with Dot were just such an intricate part of our lives, and we feel very honored to be here today and to just see the family one more time. As as mentioned about Sam, if it could run and it wasn't, he could make it run. And I remember one time he and Jimmy Cooper went over to Huntsville to look at the rope ski tow over there and decide that we could have one in Halliburton. So they took my old pickup truck and redid the rear end of it and everything, and we had the first ski tow in Halliburton County. In 1981, we completed our pastoral ministries and camp responsibilities and moved to Arizona, but we still kept connected with Sam and Dot, and whenever we would come from visiting our kids in Kingston, we'd come down the road and stop to see Sam and Dot. So we're grateful that God put this together. It's one of those times. It wasn't planned, but we feel very honored and very blessed. And thanks, Charles, for all that you have contributed in the lives of those people.
Right.
And very, very much appreciated.